Greetings, fellow Bible readers. Welcome to week 43 of our Bible read-through. This week, we continue on finishing up the book of Mark, and we begin the Gospel of Luke. Notice how in Mark's Gospel, as we continue on at chapter 7, we get a lot of details and information that is constantly pointing us ahead to Jesus' crucifixion. That's really kind of the goal and climax of all of the Gospels, Mark's in particular, and so we see that continuing to be set out before us. And then when we get into Luke's Gospel, notice how right at the beginning of his Gospel, he lays out the purpose of why he's writing his account. He's writing it to give certainty about Jesus, about his person and his work. And really that helps us to understand why there are three Gospels that are synoptics, that see the life of Jesus together. The whole purpose of these three Gospels that are all recording very similar details about the life of Jesus is not to be a boring repetition, but rather so that we have three distinct witnesses to the life of Jesus that are all telling us the essential same details about him, and thereby helping to confirm that everything that happened to and about Jesus really is true. So let's get down to the details for each day. On day 1, as we look at Mark chapters 7 through 9, notice how in chapter 7 we have presented for us the real divide between Jesus and the Pharisees and the heart of the tension between them. And that really lays the groundwork for the rest of the Gospels lead in to Jesus' crucifixion. Understanding that divide between the Pharisees and Jesus really helps us to see that road to the cross in clear detail as Jesus speaks about predicting it to his disciples and such not. Then on day 2, as we look at chapters 10 and 11, in these chapters, notice the sins that Jesus identifies and how he addresses them. Give some time to just kind of think about that. Then on day 3, as we look at chapters 12 and 13, in chapter 12, notice how Jesus, as he addresses that expert in the law, makes it clear that knowledge of God's law, of what God expects of people, will get one close to the kingdom of God. However, it's really only the gospel that can bring one into the kingdom of God by giving us the righteousness of Jesus. Then on day 4, as we look at chapters 14 and 15, notice how Jesus really becomes quieter and quieter throughout the course of these chapters. And that is because his major work of teaching is over, and now he is carrying out his work of being the suffering servant, the one who would lay down his life for the sins of the world. And so no longer is he involved in proclaiming who he is, but now he is involved in carrying out that work. Then on day 5, as we read chapters 16 of Mark and chapter 1 of Luke, we already mentioned how chapter 1 kind of lays out the goal and purpose of Luke's gospel. But before that, we should maybe say a word about Mark chapter 16. It's one of the more noteworthy chapters in the New Testament, in part because of its resurrection account, which really is very personal in some ways with that addition of the words "and Peter," kind of tying back to Peter's denial and assuring him of Jesus' forgiveness. However, probably the reason why Mark 16 is more noteworthy for many is the fact that in most modern copies of the Bible, there will be a footnote either before verse 9 or at the end of verse 20 that identifies that those verses are not found in some of the earliest copies that we have of the New Testament. And so because of that, sometimes Christians can be troubled and wonder, really, do these verses belong in the Bible or don't they? The fact of the matter is that we have evidence of those verses being a part of the scriptures going back into the 100s AD. And so Christians really shouldn't trouble themselves by some of the modern concerns that have been raised about that longer ending. Then on day 6, as we look at chapters 2 and 3 of the Gospel of Luke, notice how Luke grounds the accounts in these chapters to specific times and specific places. He's very careful to give details that connect these events to times and places to help to verify them and to help drive home that he really is recording actual history, not myth or legend. And then finally on day 7, as we look at chapters 4 through 6, in chapter 6, you'll start to notice that some of the content sounds very familiar to what we saw back in the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. And that has led some people to speculate that, well, there's some inconsistencies and contradictions between the Gospels because Jesus in Matthew's Gospel delivered this sermon on a mountain, and Luke tells us here in Luke chapter 6 that Jesus delivered this sermon on a plain. And these sometimes can cause some challenges for believers and some questions and some wondering. However, as believers, we want to recognize that there are a number of ways that these seeming discrepancies can be resolved and reconciled. First of all, probably the easiest and most likely explanation is that back in a day and age when they didn't have video recording equipment, when you couldn't just simply record something and post it on YouTube or make DVD copies for people to watch again at their pleasure, you would have to repeat a message multiple times in different settings in order for that message to be shared with a larger and larger audience. And so it's not unlikely that Jesus preached largely the same content on more than one occasion because there were different people who came to hear him on different occasions. The other possibility is that maybe both of these accounts, the one in Matthew with the Sermon on the Mount and Luke's account of the Sermon on the Plain, so to speak, that these really are the same event, and maybe that level place where Jesus preached was on top of a mountain or part of the way up a mountain, that you had an incline and then a level place, and then either the mountain went up more or maybe it went down on the other side and you had like a plateau kind of deal. But whatever the case, there's plenty of reasonable and logical explanations to reconcile those two accounts, that really the unreasonable and irrational thing would be to assume that there's a contradiction. That's all for this week. We'll see you next week.